Marcus stood in the hallway of the home he had built with Amara Whitfield, his phone gripped so tight his knuckles had gone pale. And he was not asking her to make this call, he was demanding it. Amara stared at him, her thumb hovering over the name Simone Carter, a name she had heard whispered by staff, by friends, by strangers who thought she did not already know. What Marcus did not know, what he could never have imagined standing in that hallway that night, was that a lawyer named Harold Bishop was already on another line, holding a folder that would change everything Marcus thought he understood about his own marriage, his own future, and the woman he had just ordered to dial her husband's mistress like she was nothing more than an inconvenience standing between him and the life he wanted. Her thumb pressed down on the screen. The phone began to ring. Marcus leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, a small satisfied look pulling at the corner of his mouth, as if forcing his wife to call the woman he had been sleeping with for the better part of a year was some kind of victory, some kind of proof that he was still the one in control. He had no idea that control had already slipped through his fingers days earlier, the moment Elias Whitfield closed his eyes for the final time in a hospital room 3 states away, leaving behind a will that named exactly one heir. Not a foundation, not a business partner, not even a son he had once been close to. One name, written in ink that Marcus had never seen and would never have believed if someone had shown it to him that night. Amara's face did not change when the call connected. That was the part that would haunt Marcus later, when he had time to sit with everything that happened, when he replayed this exact moment over and over trying to find the crack in her expression that should have warned him. There was none. She simply lifted the phone to her ear, looked her husband directly in the eyes, and let the silence stretch just long enough for him to feel the first flicker of doubt, the first small crack in the confidence he had walked into that hallway with. Somewhere across town, in an office with the lights still on long after everyone else had gone home, Harold Bishop checked his watch, opened the folder in front of him, and waited for his own phone to ring, because he knew exactly what was about to unfold in that house, and he knew Marcus had no idea what was coming for him. Simone answered on the 3rd ring. Her voice came through soft and careful, the way a person speaks when they suspect the ground beneath them is not as steady as they believed. Amara said nothing at first. She let Marcus stand there in the silence he had created, let him feel the weight of what he had just forced his own wife to do, and only then did she speak, calm and even, asking Simone a single question that made Marcus's jaw tighten in a way Amara had never seen before. It was not a question about love. It was not a question about betrayal. It was a question about money, about a wire transfer, about an account Marcus believed no one else knew existed. And in that single sentence, Amara let both of them understand that she had known far more than either of them had ever given her credit for. To understand how they arrived at that hallway, at that phone call, at that moment neither one of them could walk back from. It helps to go back nearly 2 years, to a spring afternoon when Amara Whitfield was still working long hours at a mid-sized accounting firm in Atlanta, a job she was good at but never talked about with pride, the kind of job that paid the bills and little else. She had grown up watching her mother work 2 jobs to keep their small apartment, watching the name Whitfield spoken with a strange mixture of respect and bitterness whenever her mother's side of the family came up, though Amara never fully understood why. Her grandfather Elias was a man she had met exactly 4 times in her life, each visit shorter and more distant than the last, a towering figure in business magazines who felt, to a young girl growing up without much, like a stranger wearing her last name. Marcus entered her life at a charity dinner neither of them had planned to attend for long. He was magnetic in a way that made rooms shift around him, the kind of man who remembered names, who complimented without flattery, who seemed to already know exactly what a woman like Amara needed to hear to feel seen for the first time in years. What she did not know then, what she would only piece together much later, was that Marcus had already heard the name Whitfield mentioned in passing that same week, in a conversation about old Atlanta money and a reclusive businessman who had quietly built one of the largest private fortunes in the country while staying almost entirely out of public view. Marcus filed that detail away the way he filed away everything useful, without letting it show on his face. Their courtship moved fast, faster than Amara's mother felt comfortable with, though she never said so directly, only asking careful questions that Amara brushed aside as an overprotective parent's worry. Marcus proposed within 8 months, In a private rooftop dinner he had arranged down to the smallest detail, the kind of gesture that photographs beautifully and says everything except the one thing that matters most, which is whether the person kneeling actually sees the person in front of them or simply sees an opportunity dressed in a nice dress. Amara said yes with tears in her eyes, believing, the way most people want to believe, that she had finally found someone who chose her simply because of who she was. The first time Amara heard the name Simone Carter, it was said casually, in passing, during a work call Marcus took at the dinner table without excusing himself the way he normally would have. He mentioned needing Simone to review something before a meeting, and Amara thought nothing of it at the time, filing it away the same unremarkable way anyone files away the name of a colleague they have never met. It would be nearly a year before that name resurfaced in a way that made her stomach turn, a year during which Marcus grew quietly more distant, more secretive with his phone, more prone to disappearing for hours at a time under the explanation of a business trip that never seemed to have a clear return date attached to it. Elias Whitfield, in that same stretch of time, was living out his final years in a large but unassuming house 2 states away, cared for by a small staff and visited more often by his attorney, Harold Bishop, than by any member of his own family. He had spent decades estranged from most of them, a falling out rooted in a business dispute so old that even the people involved had started to forget the exact details, remembering only the anger it left behind. But Elias had not forgotten Amara. He had kept a folder of his own for years, quiet updates gathered through people Amara never knew were watching, small proof that somewhere in a family that had mostly abandoned him, there was a granddaughter who had built her own modest life through nothing but her own effort, without ever once asking him for a single dollar. Meanwhile, Marcus's company was sliding further into trouble than even his closest business partners realized. A key contract had fallen through. A warehouse expansion had gone over budget by a number that made his stomach drop every time he looked at it, and creditors who had once been patient were starting to ask harder questions with shorter deadlines attached. It was during this stretch, desperate and unwilling to let anyone see the cracks forming, that Marcus began meeting more frequently with Simone Carter, officially brought in as a financial consultant to help restructure the company's debt, though the arrangement between them would come to involve far more than restructuring alone. Simone was sharp in a way that made people underestimate her, soft-spoken until the moment a room needed someone to take control, and she recognized in Marcus a man who was one bad quarter away from losing everything he had spent a decade building. What began as late nights reviewing spreadsheets slowly became something else entirely, a closeness built first on shared stress, and later on something Marcus told himself was different from betrayal because it felt, in the moment, like the only place he could exhale. He told himself Amara would never need to know, the same way he told himself the company's debt was temporary, the same way he told himself every small lie that eventually stacked into something too large to carry alone. Amara began noticing changes so small, she almost talked herself out of trusting her own instincts, the way most people do when the person they love starts slipping away from them one quiet decision at a time. Marcus grew short-tempered over things that had never bothered him before. He started taking calls in another room, phone always face down on whatever surface was nearest, a habit that had crept in so gradually she could not point to the exact day it started. She told herself it was stress from work, told her mother the same thing over the phone when her mother gently asked if everything was all right. And for a long time she believed her own explanation more than she believed what her instincts were quietly trying to tell her. The call that changed everything for Amara came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, not from Marcus, but from a number she did not recognize, a soft-spoken man who introduced himself simply as Harold Bishop, an attorney representing the estate of Elias Whitfield. Amara sat in her car in a grocery store parking lot for nearly 20 minutes after that call ended, unable to move, unable to fully process the sentence that kept replaying in her mind, that her grandfather had passed away peacefully the week before, and that she was named as the sole heir to an estate valued at just over $50 billion. She did not cry the way she expected to. She simply sat very still, gripping the steering wheel, trying to understand how a man she had met 4 times in her entire life had chosen her, out of everyone, to carry forward everything he had built. Harold asked her, gently but directly, not to share the news with anyone yet. explaining that estates of this size required careful handling in the earliest days, and that he needed time to finalize certain protections before the will became public knowledge in any capacity. Amara agreed without fully understanding why the request felt so urgent to him, though she would come to understand it completely in the weeks that followed. She drove home that day and said nothing to Marcus, not out of suspicion yet, but simply because the news felt too enormous to speak out loud before she had even begun to process it herself. In some quiet part of her, a part she did not yet trust enough to listen to fully, wanted to wait and watch a little longer before she let her husband into a secret this large. It was Harold Bishop, in their second private meeting, who gently raised a possibility Amara had not yet allowed herself to consider, that the sudden surge of quiet interest in Elias Whitfield's estate over the past several months may not have been unrelated to her own marriage. He did not accuse Marcus directly. He simply laid out a timeline, careful and factual, showing Amara how closely certain financial inquiries lined up with moments in her own life she had once brushed off as coincidence. She sat across from him in his office, feeling something cold settle into her chest as pieces she had never connected before began sliding into place, one after another, faster than she was ready for. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Harold Bishop did not rush her through what he laid out that afternoon. He let Amara sit with each detail, watching her face carefully the way a man does when he has spent decades reading people across a negotiating table, and he waited for her to ask the questions herself rather than pushing conclusions on her before she was ready to hear them. He told her that roughly 10 months earlier, an inquiry had come into the estate's financial office from a firm claiming to represent a philanthropic research group, asking detailed questions about the structure of Elias Whitfield's holdings, questions far too specific for anyone conducting simple background research. When his own investigator traced the firm back through several layers, the trail led to a small consulting office in Atlanta, one that shared an address with a company Amara recognized instantly, because it was the same building where Marcus's logistics company kept its headquarters. Amara asked, in a voice that came out steadier than she expected, whether Harold was telling her that Marcus had known about her grandfather's fortune before either of them had ever discussed it openly. Harold chose his words with the same care he had used building the rest of the timeline, telling her only what the evidence actually showed rather than what it implied, because he understood the danger of leading a grieving woman toward a conclusion that could shape decisions she was not yet prepared to make. What the evidence showed, plainly, was that someone connected to Marcus's company had been quietly gathering information about the Whitfield estate for nearly a year, long before Elias Whitfield had grown seriously ill, long before there was any public reason to expect his passing was near. That night, Amara sat across the dinner table from Marcus and studied him in a way she had never allowed herself to before, watching the small, practiced ease with which he spoke about his day, the way he asked about hers with just enough warmth to sound genuine, without ever slowing down long enough to actually listen to her answer. She thought about every late night over the past year, every closed door, every explanation that had sounded reasonable in the moment and strange only in hindsight, and for the first time, she let herself consider the possibility that the man across the table had built an entire version of their marriage around something he had known and she had not. It was nearly 3 weeks later that Amara first heard the name Simone Carter attached to something more than a passing work reference. She had gone looking for a printed document in Marcus's home office, something unrelated entirely, and found instead a folder tucked behind a drawer divider that was not meant to be found, filled with financial statements bearing a name she did not recognize alongside notes in handwriting that was clearly not Marcus's own. She photographed every page with her phone before returning the folder exactly as she had found it, her hands steady in a way that surprised her, because somewhere in the past several weeks, the shock of discovery had begun hardening into something closer to resolve. She brought the photographs to Harold Bishop the following week, and it was in that meeting that the full shape of what Marcus and Simone had built together finally came into focus. Simone Carter was not simply a financial consultant helping restructure a struggling company. She was, according to the documents Amara had found, listed as a signatory on 2 accounts connected to Marcus's business, accounts that had received a series of transfers over the past year from sources that traced back, through several careful layers, to attempts at leveraging Amara's future inheritance as collateral, long before Elias Whitfield had died. Long before any legal claim to that inheritance actually existed. Harold explained, as gently as the information allowed, that what Marcus appeared to have done bordered on financial fraud, using the anticipated value of an inheritance that was not yet his wife's, and would never have belonged to him regardless, to secure loans he had no legitimate right to leverage. Amara listened without interrupting, feeling something inside her shift from grief into a colder, steadier kind of clarity, the kind that comes only after someone has spent weeks preparing themselves for a truth they already suspected long before they had proof of it sitting in front of them. It was Harold who first proposed the plan that would eventually lead to that hallway, that phone call, that moment neither Marcus nor Simone would see coming. He explained to Amara that the will her grandfather had left behind contained a specific clause, one Elias had insisted on years earlier after watching too many family fortunes destroyed by spouses who married into money rather than into genuine partnership. The clause stated plainly that if it could be demonstrated Amara's marriage had been entered into or maintained through deliberate financial deception connected to the estate, full and immediate control of the entire inheritance would transfer to her alone, with no shared claim, no community property argument, nothing Marcus could touch regardless of what any prenuptial agreement between them might otherwise suggest. Amara asked Harold what it would take to prove that clause applied to her situation, and Harold told her the truth, that the photographs and financial records she had already gathered were a strong foundation, but that the strongest possible proof would come from Marcus and Simone revealing the nature of their arrangement themselves, in a moment neither of them expected to be documented, a moment where their guard would be down completely because they believed they still held all the power in the room. It was Harold who suggested, carefully and only after making certain Amara understood exactly what she was agreeing to, that the fastest way to draw that moment out was to let Marcus believe he was the one forcing her hand, rather than the other way around. Over the following days, Amara began making small, deliberate changes to her behavior at home, changes calculated to push Marcus toward exactly the kind of reckless confidence that had gotten him into this mess in the first place. She let slip, in a conversation she made sure sounded unplanned, that she had heard rumors about a woman named Simone, framing it just vaguely enough that Marcus could not be certain how much she actually knew. She watched him grow defensive, then dismissive, then, over the course of several days, increasingly convinced that the best way to handle a wife he believed was growing suspicious was to confront the situation head-on, on his own terms, in a way that would let him control the narrative before she could gather anything resembling proof. And so, when Marcus stood in that hallway with his phone extended toward his wife, demanding she dial the woman he had been building a second life with, he believed he was delivering a punishment. He had no way of knowing he was delivering, instead, the single piece of evidence that would strip him of a fortune he had spent nearly 2 years quietly scheming to attach himself to, evidence that would arrive not through some elaborate confrontation staged by lawyers in a courtroom, but through his own voice, his own hand, forcing the exact call that would unravel him completely. The phone rang twice before Simone picked up, and in that brief stretch of silence, Marcus's confidence still had not wavered. He watched his wife's face, expecting to see it crumble the way he had imagined it would for days, expecting tears, expecting the kind of desperate apology that would let him feel, one more time, like the person in control of this marriage. What he saw instead was something closer to stillness, a calm that did not match the moment he thought he was creating, and for the first time that evening, a small, unfamiliar discomfort moved through him, quiet enough that he told himself it was nothing. Simone's voice came through the speaker, hesitant, unsure who exactly she was speaking to until Amara identified herself in a tone that gave nothing away. Marcus watched Simone's name settle into the space between them, watched his wife hold the phone with a steadiness that did not belong to a woman who had just learned, moments earlier by his own design, that her husband had been unfaithful. He did not yet understand that Amara already knew every detail Simone might have tried to hide, had known for weeks, had spent those weeks building a case with a precision neither Marcus nor Simone had thought to prepare for. Marcus reached for the phone, his voice rising in a way that surprised even him. trying to pull the conversation back under his control the way he had pulled every difficult moment back under his control for the better part of his adult life. Amara stepped back, just out of his reach, and continued speaking to Simone as though he were not in the room at all, asking a second question, then a third, each one landing with the same quiet precision. Each one built from a document Marcus had once believed was hidden safely enough that his wife would never think to look for it. Simone's voice, when she finally spoke again, had lost every trace of the careful confidence she usually carried, replaced instead by the unmistakable sound of someone realizing, in real time, that she had been standing far closer to the edge of something serious than Marcus had ever let her believe. It was somewhere in the middle of that call, as Marcus's voice grew louder and Amara's grew steadier, that his phone buzzed once in his pocket, a message from a number he did not recognize, sent at the exact moment his own scheme was collapsing in front of him. He would not read that message until later that night, sitting alone in a car outside a house he no longer felt welcome inside. A short message from Harold Bishop confirming that everything discussed on that call had already been documented, filed, and forwarded to the appropriate parties, exactly as planned. Amara ended the call the same way she had entered it, calm, unhurried, offering no explanation to Marcus for what he had just watched unfold in front of him. She set the phone down on the table between them, looked at her husband standing in the hallway of the home they had shared, and said nothing at all, because for the first time in nearly 2 years, there was nothing left that needed to be said out loud. Marcus stood there, the silence pressing down on him harder than anything Amara could have shouted, slowly beginning to understand that the woman he had underestimated from the very beginning had just closed the door on everything he thought he still controlled. What happens next changes the entire direction of Marcus's life, and it begins with a knock on the door that neither of them expected quite so soon. Marcus turned toward the sound before Amara did, some old instinct telling him that whatever was standing on the other side of that door was not going to make the night any easier. Amara did not move. She stood exactly where she had been standing when the call ended, watching her husband cross the hallway, watching him hesitate for a second longer than a man with nothing to hide usually would before finally pulling the door open. On the porch stood 2 people Marcus did not recognize, dressed plainly, holding a folder that looked, in the porch light, almost identical to the one Harold Bishop had been carrying 2 blocks away only minutes earlier. The taller of the 2 introduced himself, his voice even and practiced, the voice of someone who had delivered difficult news to strangers more times than he could count. He asked, politely but without any real room for negotiation, whether he was speaking with Marcus, and when Marcus confirmed his own name with a growing unease he could not quite hide, the man explained that he was there on behalf of a financial oversight office investigating irregular activity connected to several business accounts under Marcus's name. Marcus felt the porch tilt slightly beneath him, though nothing had physically moved at all, and for the first time that night, the confidence that had carried him through every difficult conversation of his adult life failed to arrive when he needed it most. Amara watched from a few steps back, close enough to hear every word, far enough that no one on the porch could have mistaken her for someone caught by surprise. She had known, of course, that this moment was coming, had known for nearly a week exactly when it would arrive, though she had not expected it to land quite this fast, quite this close on the heels of the phone call she had just finished making. Harold had warned her that once the documentation from tonight's call reached the right hands, things could move quickly, but even she felt something tighten in her chest watching 2 strangers stand on her porch delivering the opening move of what would become a much longer unraveling. Marcus turned back toward Amara, his expression shifting through something that looked almost like pleading, as if some part of him believed she might still step in, might still soften whatever was happening, the way a wife who loved him unconditionally might have done only weeks earlier. Amara held his gaze without flinching, without offering him a single word of comfort, and in that silence Marcus finally understood, completely, and without any remaining doubt, that the woman standing in his hallway that night was not the same woman he had married 2 years earlier, and had perhaps never fully been her at all, not in the way he had assumed. Not in the way he had counted on when he built every quiet scheme around the belief that she would never look closely enough to notice. The 2 visitors did not stay long. They left behind a set of documents requiring Marcus's response within a narrow window of days, along with a warning that further inquiries would follow depending on what those documents revealed. When the door finally closed behind them, the house fell into a silence heavier than anything either Marcus or Amara had experienced in the entire 2 years of their marriage, a silence that told both of them, in its own way, that whatever came next would not be a conversation between husband and wife anymore, but something closer to two separate futures beginning to pull apart from a single fractured point. It would take weeks for the full scope of what Marcus had done to come into public view, weeks during which Simone Carter would face her own reckoning for the role she had played, weeks during which Harold Bishop would guide Amara through a process far more complicated than either of them had anticipated when this plan first began. But standing in that hallway, in the immediate quiet after the door closed, none of that had happened yet. There was only Marcus, staring at the folder in his hands, and Amara, standing several feet away, finally allowing herself, for the first time in nearly 2 years, to breathe. The days that followed moved slower than either of them expected, the kind of slow that comes only after something enormous has already happened and the world simply has not caught up to it yet. Marcus spent most of that first week making phone calls to lawyers of his own, men who listened patiently and then, one after another, explained in careful legal language that the documentation already gathered against him left very little room to maneuver. Each conversation ended roughly the same way, with Marcus sitting alone afterward, phone in hand, staring at a screen that had once made him feel powerful and now felt like the very thing that had exposed him. Simone Carter, for her part, was brought in for questioning twice within that first week, and it became clear very quickly that she had not fully understood the depth of what Marcus had built around her. She had known about the affair, had known about the late-night meetings that slowly became something more, but she had believed, or told herself she believed, that the financial arrangement between them was simply an ordinary consulting relationship, not a scheme built on leveraging an inheritance that legally belonged to someone else entirely. When investigators laid out the full timeline in front of her, showing her exactly how her name had been used on documents she barely remembered signing, something in her expression shifted from defensive to genuinely uncertain, the look of a person realizing she had been standing closer to the center of someone else's plan than she had ever agreed to. Harold Bishop moved through this stretch of the story with the same quiet precision he had shown from the very beginning, meeting with Amara twice a week to walk her through each new development before it became public, shielding her as much as possible from the growing attention the case was starting to attract. Word had begun spreading through certain business circles that the reclusive Elias Whitfield had left his entire fortune to a granddaughter almost no one had heard of, and that her husband was already under investigation for financial misconduct connected to the very inheritance he had married into. Reporters started calling the office, then calling Amara's old workplace, then eventually showing up outside the house itself, and Harold worked quietly behind the scenes to keep the most sensitive details out of public reach until the legal process had time to run its proper course. Amara found herself, in those weeks, stepping into a version of her own life she had never imagined for herself, learning the language of estate law, sitting through meetings with financial advisors who spoke about numbers so large they barely felt real, all while still processing the grief of losing a grandfather she had only just begun to understand. She kept returning, in quiet moments, to the handful of memories she had of Elias, the careful way he had once looked at her during their last visit, the sense, even then, that he had been studying her more closely than she realized, deciding something about her long before she ever knew there was anything to decide. It was nearly a month after that night in the hallway that Marcus finally sat down across from Amara for what would be their last real conversation as husband and wife. He did not defend himself the way she expected him to. He simply talked, slowly, about the fear that had driven every decision, the terror of watching a company he had built from nothing slide toward collapse, the shame that had made lying feel, at the time, like the only available option. Amara listened without interrupting, the same way she had listened to Harold months earlier, and when Marcus finally finished speaking, she told him the one thing she had been carrying since the night of that phone call, that she had not needed him to be perfect, only honest, and that everything else, all of it, had been a choice he made entirely on his own. The final piece of the case against Marcus came together roughly 6 weeks later, When forensic accountants working with Harold's office uncovered a second set of transfers neither Marcus nor Simone had disclosed during questioning, transfers that traced back even further than anyone had initially realized, revealing that Marcus's financial troubles and his interest in the Whitfield name ran deeper and older than even Amara had allowed herself to imagine. The accountants had been tracing a smaller, unrelated account tied to Marcus's logistics company when they noticed an inconsistency in the paperwork, a company formation dated nearly 5 years before Marcus and Amara had ever met. Registered under a name, Marcus had quietly retired years before he built the business Amara knew. Curious about why a man would abandon one company only to start another under a different name, the investigators pulled the older filings, and what they found there changed the entire shape of the story Amara had believed she was living inside. 5 years earlier, before Atlanta, before the logistics company, before any version of Marcus that Amara had ever known, he had been engaged to a woman named Renata Ford, the daughter of a wealthy real estate developer in Charlotte. The engagement had ended abruptly, according to old court filings Harold's team located, following a dispute over funds that had gone missing from a joint account Renata's father had allowed the couple to manage together while planning their wedding. No charges had ever been filed. Renata's family, embarrassed and unwilling to draw public attention to the situation, had quietly ended the relationship and moved on, and Marcus had disappeared from that world entirely, resurfacing years later in Atlanta under a rebuilt image, a new company, and eventually a new name attached to a new fortune he had learned about long before he ever attended the charity dinner where he first introduced himself to Amara. Sitting across from Harold as this information was laid out in front of her, Amara felt something colder settle into her chest than anything she had experienced in the weeks since that night in the hallway. It was one thing to learn her husband had lied about an affair, had schemed to leverage an inheritance that was never his to touch. It was another thing entirely to understand that the man she married had done this before, that the charm which had once made her feel chosen was, in fact, a method he had practiced and refined on someone else's family years earlier, a method that had simply worked better the second time because Amara, unlike Renata, had no father standing guard over the money to notice the pattern before the wedding ever happened. Harold explained, carefully, that this discovery would strengthen the case significantly, establishing a demonstrated pattern of behavior that would matter both in the ongoing investigation into Marcus's conduct and in the civil proceedings Amara's legal team was preparing regarding the estate. But he also understood, watching her sit quietly with this new information, that the legal implications were the smaller part of what she was absorbing in that moment. What she was truly sitting with was the realization that nothing about the man she had built a life with had ever been the accident of circumstance she once believed it to be, that from the very beginning, she had been chosen the same way a hunter chooses ground, carefully, deliberately, with a plan already forming before she ever knew his name. Amara asked Harold, quietly, whether Renata Ford knew what had happened to her, whether anyone had ever told the woman that the man who once vanished from her life had simply moved on to build the exact same scheme somewhere else. Harold told her that his office had, in fact, reached out to Renata during the course of the investigation, and that she had agreed to speak with them, offering her own account of what had happened 5 years earlier, an account that matched, almost detail for detail, the pattern investigators were now seeing repeat itself in Amara's own marriage. It was Renata's account, delivered in a formal statement 2 weeks later, that finally closed the last remaining gap in the case, confirming beyond any reasonable doubt that Marcus had approached both relationships with the same calculated intent, and that Amara had not simply fallen victim to a husband who made poor choices under financial pressure, but to a man who had built an entire second identity around the specific pursuit of exactly this kind of opportunity. When that statement was formally entered into the case file, something in Amara finally settled, not into relief exactly, but into a clarity sharp enough to carry her through whatever came next. The legal proceedings that followed moved with the particular slowness of cases involving significant wealth, stretching across several months of filings, depositions, and closed-door negotiations that rarely made their way into public reporting. Marcus, facing both the civil claims tied to the estate and a separate criminal inquiry into the fraudulent transfers uncovered by Harold's team, ultimately chose to settle rather than risk a trial that his own attorneys quietly admitted he had little chance of winning. The settlement stripped him of any remaining claim to funds connected to the Whitfield estate, required restitution tied directly to the fraudulent transfers, and included an admission, buried in the legal language but unmistakable to anyone who read it closely, that he had knowingly misrepresented his financial dealings throughout the marriage. Simone Carter's case resolved differently, in a way that surprised even Amara when she first heard the outcome. Prosecutors, weighing the evidence, concluded that while Simone had benefited from and participated in parts of the scheme, she had not fully understood the extent of what Marcus was building, nor had she been the architect of it the way the earliest headlines about the case had assumed. She agreed to cooperate fully with the ongoing investigation, providing testimony that helped confirm the timeline Harold's office had already assembled, and in exchange, avoided the harsher criminal exposure Marcus ultimately faced. Whether that outcome felt fair depended entirely on who you asked, but Amara, when she finally heard the full resolution, felt no particular need to weigh in on it herself. Her focus, by then, had already moved elsewhere. She thought often, in that first year, about the 4 brief visits she had shared with her grandfather as a child, replaying them with a new understanding of what he might have been quietly measuring each time he looked at her a little too closely for a man who was, by every account, not an especially warm person. She came to believe, though she would never know for certain, that Elias Whitfield had spent years watching from a distance, waiting to see whether the granddaughter he barely knew would grow into someone who valued substance over appearance, someone who would notice, the way he always had, that the people who talk the least are often paying the closest attention. In the end, she had proven herself exactly that, not because she set out to inherit an empire, but because she had simply refused to stop paying attention when it mattered most. Marcus, for his part, rebuilt a much smaller life in the aftermath, the kind of life that comes after a person's name has been publicly attached to a story people whisper about at dinner parties for years afterward. He gave no public interviews, offered no public defense beyond what his lawyers required, and disappeared, much the way he had disappeared once before after Renata Ford, into a quieter existence far removed from the world he had once tried so hard to marry his way into. Looking back on everything that unfolded, from that first tense moment in the hallway to everything that followed in the months after, the question worth sitting with is not simply whether justice was served, but whether any of it could have been stopped earlier, whether the quiet signs were there all along for anyone willing to look closely enough. Would you have noticed the red flags in Marcus's story before Amara did? Would you have trusted the same instincts that led her to build a case of her own, quietly, patiently, long before anyone else believed there was anything to find? If this story kept you watching until the very end, let us know in the comments what stood out to you the most. And if you want to see another story just like this one, stay close, because what happened in our next case is even harder to believe. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next true story we bring you.